Hi, my name is Divya. I'm from Azim Premji University, and I'm going to be talking about evolution today for this I Think Biology course as part of NPTEL course. Let's look at this slide, which has various diversity kinds of plants and animals and microbes on this. This is a cartoon representation of the breathtaking diversity that we can see in nature in our planet. So there are various kinds of organisms here. So the question is, how did this diversity come about? And how did so many species arise in nature? How can we see even newer species are arising and evolving? And what is the reason behind this kind of diversity and various life forms on Earth? So today's lecture, we are going to talk about the historical context for evolution. So I'm going to set a stage about what people were thinking before the idea of evolution came about, a formal definition of evolution and ways in which evolution can occur, evidences of evolution, and why do we even have to care about evolution. Okay, so that's the outline of today's lecture. So earlier, so this is before 1800s, mostly in Europe, people were thinking that God created various life forms and each species was independently and separately created. Earth is very young and life on Earth is also very young, and species once created don't change on their own. So this was a creationist kind of view of history of life. But then several people in the early 1800s started looking at various, they were looking at various geological formations on Earth, and they also looked at fossil records. They were, Linnaeus was grouping organisms, were binning organisms which looked alike, and he was classifying organisms. And, around that time, people started, they had a different notion about how life is present, how life forms are evolving, or how life is organized. So this is the idea of descent with modification. That means that life species or life or different species or organisms change over time. New life forms arise from older ones, and all life forms on Earth are related. That means they have a common ancestor. And Earth itself is very old, and life on Earth is also quite old, that is around 3.5 billion years ago. So let me expand on this life on Earth being quite old. Let's compress this life on Earth concept. Let's this 3.5 billion, around 3.5 billion years ago thing into a year. Okay, so this is a graphical representation of that. So this is, say, in a calendar, let's say Big Bang happened in January. Actually, life didn't come about till first cell or first life form didn't come about till September. So this is, if we are dividing the entire life on Earth for a 12-month period, how did life progress? So for about August till September, nothing happened after Big Bang. And then people through this is all through fossil record and other kinds of information, that first life might have evolved only as late as September. And first multicellular organisms evolved or came into picture only in the last 1 or 2 months. That is only in November, if we can think, first multicellular organisms came about. And in December, a lot of events happened. Oxygen was not present in the atmosphere, and oxygen came about roughly maybe around early in December. And if you look at several other popular events, such as when did dinosaurs evolve or when did mammals evolve, that's only in the last week of December, right? And if you look at when did humans actually evolve on Earth, it's only at the very end. So December, the last day of December, very close to midnight is when human beings came into Earth or human beings evolved. So it's not to tell that, okay, only in December human beings evolved. I'm compressing the entire life on Earth, several billions years of information. It's difficult to understand billions of years, so people have actually represented it in a calendar year, or it can even be viewed as, if you had only 24 hours, then how did life evolve? But this is in a calendar year. How did or when did different events happen? So this is a timeline for you to understand when did different things evolve, when did organisms evolve, or when did known things like human beings evolved on Earth. Evolution happened on Earth. But at the time of 1800s, people were still thinking that life and Earth are young, and once formed species don't change. And those ideas were challenged and they were modified by several people. And but two most important people are Charles Darwin, whom most of you would have heard, and Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin. And he also simultaneously had this idea that life form changes over time, and all the species on Earth are related to each other and they have evolved from a common ancestors. So both these naturalists and scientists independently came about this idea. But of course, we know that Darwin formally proposed the idea of evolution and speciation, and through his book. But what is less known is Wallace also independently came up with this. In fact, Wallace worked in Malayan archipelago, and he worked on several invertebrates, and he worked on concepts of mimicry and camouflage. And in fact, through all those ideas, he wrote a letter to Darwin saying that, look, maybe we can explain the origin of life and how interconnected different species are by the concept of natural selection and evolution. And they had exchanged letters back then. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about what is evolution and what is not by this example. So let's take a tree which which changes over time. Say this is a tree which has no leaves, and over time, over seasonal changes, it develops leaves, and of course, over some more time, the leaves might actually fall down. It might change color. It might, in the fall, it might change color and finally fall off to become again leafless. So it changes over time, but this is not a biological evolution. Changes happening over its lifetime is not biological evolution. Let's look at this example here. There is an ancestral, some life form, tetrapod, that means it has 4 legs. And from that, there are several other tetrapods which has come from this common ancestor. So be it a whale, human, lizard, or a bird form, these have basically changed from a common ancestor. It has modified from a common ancestor, turning into various other species. It's not that what I'm saying is not that this particular thing has changed into these many species, but all of them have a common ancestor. So this is biological evolution. That means that a formal definition of evolution is descent with modification. That means life forms all are related, but they change over time and they modify over time, and that particular trait which undergoes modification has to be inherited. Only then it's considered as evolution. Let's take one more example. Which of these following are not evolutionary changes? A monkey learns to steal food from your house. A young man starts lifting weights and builds his biceps. There is a plant which is pruned to make a bonsai, or antibiotic resistance in bacteria. I'll give a bit of time for you to think about what are not evolutionary changes. As you can tell, the first three, a monkey stealing food from the house, a man building his biceps, or a plant that is pruned to become a bonsai, are all changes within the lifetime. And these are acquired changes. And this change is not transferred to the next generation. So these are not evolutionary changes. Whereas antibiotic resistance in bacteria is, I'll explain this in a bit, but this is an evolutionary change because certain bacteria might have acquired resistance, or it might have certain genes in it might have mutated, and it might have acquired resistance. And if those are heritable changes, that means that if it can pass on that quality or that trait from one generation to next generation, or even through horizontal transfer, if another bacteria acquires that information and also develops resistance to a particular antibiotic, that is considered evolution. So in order to consider for it to be a biological evolution, these changes have to be inherited from one generation to the next. So here is a formal definition of evolution. It's descent with modification from a common ancestor. There's always a common ancestor. And evolution is responsible for all the similarities between related organisms and also a huge diversity of life. So what I showed you in the first slide about like this, fascinating diversity of life is because evolution is responsible for that diversity of life also. So there are three primary requirements for evolution to act. Now we are looking at population of a particular species. So let's take this cartoon example of a beetle. So I have written here that there is variation in a population. That means that let's imagine there are brown colored beetles and green colored beetles. So that is, there are different coloration in the beetle population. It's like saying in human beings, there are some tall individuals and some shorter individuals in a classroom. Let's imagine you go to a particular class, or in your own larger community, there are some tall individuals, some short individuals, and that represents variation in the trait of being tall or short. Here it is variation in color. So in any given population, there has to be some kind of variation for evolution to act on. Then those particular variation has to be heritable. That means that it's not enough to have variation, but a particular, say, what I mean by heritability is that trait, whether it is height of an individual or whether it is color of a beetle, it has to be encoded in the DNA in order to pass it on to the next generation of the population, next generation of individuals. So there has to be variation in a population, and that trait has to be heritable. And there has to be differential survival or differential reproduction in that population. So here there is a bird which is selectively eating, green beetles, which are kind of sticking out because they are sitting on a brown tree. Whereas brown beetles here are kind of camouflage, so that birds find it difficult for them to eat. So because of various reasons, it's might happen that only these brown beetles get to reproduce more than these green beetles. So there is also differential reproduction. So all these traits, so all these things, so variation in a population, heritable nature of that particular trait, and differential reproduction are important are needed for evolution to act on. Let's take one more example. This is a fascinating and beautiful insect called leaf mimicking katydid. You might even find it difficult to spot this in nature. So look at its wings. It's exactly like, you can even see the veins on the insect wing, which mimics the leaf vein. And there are some, ruptures. It almost feels like, okay, some leaf is old or broken, and it's if it is sitting on a green leaf, it looks it's camouflaging against its background, right? So this is a very good example of a product of natural selection, or you can say that evolution, it's a product of evolution. Now, how did this come about? Or why are we saying that this is a product of natural selection? By the way, natural selection is one of the mechanisms in which evolution can act. We'll talk a little bit more about natural selection in the next lecture, but there are various other mechanisms also, such as gene flow, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selections are 4 ways in which evolution can act. Now let's take this example and think about how it's a product of natural selection. Okay, I'm going to stop here and continue this in the next lecture.